Hey everybody, how are you? Just about ready to start our web class. I'm going to send out a little bit of a chat to everybody. Hello, how are you? Let me know if you can see and hear me. And text me any questions. All right. Hopefully everybody is doing well during this cold winter. It's been really a cold winter here in Utah. It has dumped on us. We have more snow than we've had for a long time. Thankfully, we've been in a little bit of a drought. Let me move this chair a little bit. And we're at like 160% of normal snowfall. So we're going to have a good summer with lots of farmers will be happy and our reservoirs will be full. A lot of other countries experiencing the same thing. So we're about ready to get started. I'm going to get everything. I think I got all my recorders going. Yeah, it is chilly in Southern California. That is like an oxymoron. It's always warm in Southern California. So what's the deal, right? But, well, you've heard my comments on this before, is that you have one side is talking about climate, our global warming, and then you have over here, you have that we have global cooling. They have strong evidence for both sides if you've looked at the data. And my argument is that we're just experiencing global climate change. It's just changing as it has for millions of years. So don't get too worked up about it, is my advice. All right, let's get started. Let me go right into our presentation. We're going to talk about DNA today, and we're going to talk about how it affects your bodies, your cells, or the food, how the food choices you're making is affecting your DNA. So the title of this class is How the Foods You Eat Changes Your DNA. And not just once, every single time you eat. So let's go ahead and get started. Go to my presentation, and I'd like to welcome everybody to the weekly web class that we have. I'm glad that you're here. I'm glad that you're present. And well, if you want to get any information, click on the email address, call the phone number, make sure you have the name of the person that recommended you so that they can stay in the loop of conversation, and make sure that you have the right service. It's always helpful when you have that advising person. So a little bit about me for those that have appeared for the first time. We go out on the airwaves every single week. I'm a food scientist. I specialize in metabolic syndrome and chronic disease. Been doing it for the last 12 years. I work with doctors and clinics that want to change from the traditional medicine to a holistic approach. They do it because the nation, your neighbors, your family, your friends, they're all experiencing these statistics. We're not getting healthier as a nation. We're actually getting more unhealthy. What I found is interesting is that we're doing much better of keeping people alive while in an unhealthy state. That's just seems kind of backwards, doesn't it? So we have higher rates of chronic disease than we ever have. And yet things like infection, we have less of. People dying from heart attacks is less, but we have more people that have them. Less people dying from cardiovascular disease, but more people have them. So that's what I mean by we're keeping our people alive longer in a sick state. So if you go out and look across the board, you'll see that the people that you see at the store, at the stoplight, your family, your friends, the people that you work with, they have at least one of these 4 issues, or at least 8 out of 10 do. And that is not an encouraging statistic. So I faced this same problem. 12 years ago, I was 280 pounds. My normal weight is about 191. I was fat and sick and not feeling well. I had stomach digestive issues. I had heartburn. I had acid reflux. I was pre-diabetic. I had 10 chronic issues, over 10, because I now realize that I had more chronic diseases than I was prescribed at the time. But I got over it in 12 weeks, and you can too. And that's what we talk about every week. Even though we talk about a lot of scientific findings, I go out and I research the latest in research. I'm not a doctor, and I'm a food scientist, and this information should only be used for informational purposes. Always consult your doctor when making a lifestyle change. And the content herein are examples of people that have shared their personal stories or my story, and it doesn't claim to cure any disease or ailment. So now that we have our disclaimer out, I want to ask you, I want to talk to you about your DNA and what you have done for it lately. What have you done? Is it good or is it not so good? Whatever you're doing. I took some information from a board-certified neurologist and author of 2 New York best-selling books called The Brain Maker and Grain Brain. Actually, it was the other way around. The Grain Brain came out first, and then the Brain Maker followed up by Dr. David Perlmutter. Now, in his Grain Brain book, Dr. Perlmutter discusses the popular notion that fat is bad and that we need to eat a lot more grains and carbohydrates and foods that are rich in these, and that it's better for us and it'll make us healthier. That's been the recommendation from our government and from our traditional medical advisors since 1977. You have seen my posts many, many times in many articles posting studies that test that notion, that go against that conventional ideology. Now, my idea is that perhaps we need to swing our dietary pendulum back the other way and welcome fat back to our dinner tables and reduce our consumption of these carbohydrates. I'm really excited about this most interesting, and I'm grateful for it, announcement from the United States Dietary Advisory Committee. And if you recall, that they are the group of medical professionals that meet to determine what health organizations, doctors, schools, nutritionists, basically everybody that is consulting with people about their health. The idea that that this committee is here to proclaim the advice that we should be, that's what they're there for. This committee advises us of what we should be eating, okay? They formed in 1977. Now, I did a whole web class on how these people are, or who they are, and what data they provide, and the recommendations that they make, and why they make them, how often they make them. Anyway, this same committee that started this whole no fat, high carb, salt is bad push back in 1977 recently came out with a statement that was really quite compelling and very supportive, and is the complete opposite of what they have been claiming for the last 40 years. I love it because it falls in line with what I've been promoting for the last 12 years, saying that what's making people fall apart is really their high consumption of carbs and sugars, and it's not the fat that we eat. Listen to this quote that they put out just recently. Okay? In contrast, trials that use mainly carbohydrates to replace saturated fat did not reduce cardiovascular disease. Did not reduce it. This is fantastic. They haven't done this before. They're coming right out. Let's just break that down to what this sentence means. It says, In contrast, so the opposite of the trials that used mainly carbohydrates to replace your caloric intake. So instead of eating fat, we wanted you to eat carbohydrates. And sorry, guys, the results are in, and it has not a positive effect. It does not reduce cardiovascular disease. It does not reduce heart attacks and strokes. Okay, this is big. Okay, let me explain more about why this is so such good news. The United States Dietary Advisory Committee is the nation's top dietary advisory committee, and all of the guidelines come from it. This committee is calling for the removal of limits on dietary cholesterol. The Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, that's a mouthful, sends its recommendations when it meets every 5 years out to the U.S. Department of Agriculture and to the Department of Health and Human Services, which is then released to and create the new dietary guideline. That's where you get the food pyramid and the My Plate from. The new one will come out in year 2021, and then it'll update every 5 years after that. Now, these guidelines have wide-ranging effects. They help all other federal agencies set nutritional standards for things like school meals for our children. Have you go to school with your child or your grandchild, or ask to go with your neighbor or your niece, your nephew? Go and have lunch with one of these schools that support the Obama guideline that came out during the Obama administration. The food is awful. It really is just grotesque. Okay, and schools all across the country are actually opting out of it, turning away the federal money because their students are not eating it. They are hungry, and that's not good. That's a topic for another time. But anyway, it sets the standards for our school meals for our children, our food assistance programs like WIC for unwed mothers, and serve as the basis for federal and nutritional education programs such as the My Plate that you've come to know and love, right? The guidelines also impact nutritional fact labeling on our food packages. So the guidelines of what you see when you turn that label over and look on the other side, it comes out of this committee's recommendations. And it's the foundation of dietary advice for doctors and dietitians as well. Okay, so the changes are happening to support the doctrine that we have been talking about here on this channel for so long. Even the American Heart Association and the American College of Cardiology said, get this, there's not enough scientific evidence to show that limiting dietary cholesterol lowered artery clogging LDL cholesterol in the blood. Again, this is fantastic. They're not, essentially what they're saying is, guys, we've been wrong. We've been giving you the wrong advice for 40 years. So stop listening to us and do the opposite. Now, the AHA's, the American Heart Association's previous advice suggesting limiting dietary cholesterol to less than 300 milligrams. That's a third of a gram a day. So this is great and fantastic news. This is exactly what we need to happen to have every doctor in the world start to give this type of information, this new information to their patients. Part of the reason that hasn't been happening boils basically down to lawsuits. And that's right. Doctors and hospitals, school lunch programs in, Wisconsin and small little towns in Wyoming, universities that teach doctors, they're all afraid of getting sued if they go against what the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Department of Health and Human Services are recommending. Now, it's going to take years, but now that these agencies are realizing that low fat and low salt and meat are not the problem, in fact, just the opposite, this is fantastic news. This is great. Okay, so an incredible story was published last year in the Journal Annals of Internal Medicine, and it was a meta-analysis. So several gathering all the data from several other studies, which is huge, by the way, because it included more than 500,000 participants. And it demonstrated that there's no increased risk of heart disease in people consuming a lot of saturated fat. Okay, what does that mean? Butter, bacon, animal fats, right? Dairy products, eggs, things like that. But also including vegetarian type fats like coconut oil. So yeah, the good news is that this 500,000 participant study found that they're not going to kill you after all. This is all good because slowly these agencies and departments that write the public policy are finally embracing the notion that the way that we as humans have been eating for tens of thousands of years really has served us better than the opposite eating advice that we adopted back in 1977 when fat, meat, and salt was vilified and we were told to shun it. Today's web class, though, is about giving you a new idea, giving you a new set of eyes of how you should think about the food that you're eating. Put it in a new light. Right now, food is viewed in the eyes of feed my hunger, right? And eat what tastes good at all costs. That's the bottom line. On the healthier side, we look at food as what is the macro and micronutrient made up of? What are the fats and the carbs and the proteins? Not forgetting about the vitamins and minerals and polyphenols and all the other associated nutrients. That's the healthy view. Now, the new idea that I want you to grasp is that besides the nutritional content of the foods, and I like to call that FPC, the fat, protein, and carbohydrate ratio, what's the balance of all those in your total daily intake? But besides the nutritional content of this food, we should be looking at food as data. What is the information that food is carrying with it, and the information of that data that is communicating to the rest of our body? What I mean by that is there's this beautiful dance that happens between food as an environmental effect on how it affects our own DNA. So let's talk about DNA for a second. DNA is the genetic code that determines all the characteristics of any living thing. What is the purpose of DNA? It is a nucleic acid that contains the genetic instructions, the recipe for the development of functioning living organisms. All known cellular life has DNA. The main role of DNA in the cell is the long-term storage of information. It's like a hard disk drive of who you are. So the cell, and this is important because when your cells need to be regenerated, new cells need to be broken. When you go to cut your arm, and your body relies on the genetic DNA of your body coming in and regrowing it properly, and not growing a finger out of there, or growing the same type of hair that's on your head, that in that little slit is that should be the hair on your arms, and so on, right? So this genetic information that's packed in that encoding is vital for the long-term storage of this information, so that we can re-replicate ourselves. But I want you to realize that we need to start thinking about how the foods that we're eating is actually affecting not only your body, how you feel, but actually your DNA. When you hear the term gene expression, right? What they're talking about is DNA using the information, such as from the food that you just ate. The information that food provided then communicate instructions to the rest of your cells. This process by which information from the gene is used is the synthesis of a gene product, or the new gene cell. When you're talking about DNA, you got to talk about RNA. Now, RNA and DNA work together. The main function of RNA is to carry information by form of amino acid sequence from the DNA gene to where proteins are assembled on what is called the ribosomes. Now, RNA is kind of like Verizon when sending your text message. RNA is not the message. It is the delivery system. It's the Verizon it's the service provider of data from the DNA to the rest of your body. That's what RNA is, and that's why it's so important. Okay, so now that you're up to speed on all your DNA language, let's try to look at foods that you're eating as sending information to your cells. Just like sending a text from your phone, giving instructions of what you want your husband to pick up at the grocery store, the food that we eat has the power to change the expression or the messages that your DNA is sending the rest of your body. That is called epigenetics. So the cookie that you consumed is sending data to your DNA. That cookie is trying to get the DNA to express the message that the cookie has inside of it because of what those nutrients are. Because of the DNA in that food you ate, it will send an expression of out to your cells. And it's basically saying, I want you to maintain health, or I want you to take a different path. I want you to be less healthy. What if the data or message of that cookie or that food, whatever it is, isn't the type of message that you want passed around to the rest of your cells? Kind of like a rumor, right? If it's not a rumor that's true, that's the last thing you want to do is have it passed around. So what if the food you're eating is passing around messages that you don't want your body to pick up on? What if the message is increase insulin, stop burning fat, start storing everything I'm eating as fat, use glucose as my only energy, let the muscles atrophy and grow weak, allow my cravings to go wild, let my brain cells die so I start getting dementia, and so on. Is that the message that we want? Quite literally, the food that we're eating is or is not expressing that message to ourselves. So from the recommendations given back in 1977, we can see with perfect clarity how people's DNA expressed itself on how people were maintaining their health. And that expression was getting people sicker and sicker. It's no argument. It's not a mystery that since 1977, our rate of obesity and overweight have skyrocketed. Heart disease has risen. Diabetes has risen. Alzheimer's, dementia, insulin resistance, fatty liver disease, pancreatitis. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Since 1977, when we made a major shift of what people should be eating, the amount of carbohydrates, cut out the fats, the saturated fats, and replace it with carbohydrates, and increase your fruits, which is just another healthier form of a carbohydrate. And I say healthier because it does have some fiber, does have some vitamins with it and minerals with it, unlike your soda pop or your candy. When that happened, we can see with perfect clarity what's happened over the last 40 plus years. So we can see very clearly that diet that the so-called experts have been recommending for the last few decades has been sending the wrong signals to our DNA and our DNA passing that on to our cells, making us sicker. We can link these DNA expressions at the cellular level from the foods as the real cornerstone of so many of our common Western diseases. Our ancestors lived for centuries eating a different diet than what is recommended by our health agencies today. They ate basically an FPC balanced meal, much lower carbohydrates, higher fats, 60, 70, 80% of their calories were coming from fat. And basically what we recommend on this channel. So the question has to be asked, why do we want to reinvent the wheel and think that it's not going to have an impact on our DNA, on our body? Now, we live in a country with 5.5 million of us diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Our ancestors didn't have Alzheimer's at this rate. And remember, we don't have a treatment for Alzheimer's. We have a good set of standards of how to prevent Alzheimer's, as we discussed in last week's web class, but we have no effective treatment. I want you to look at your food choices as literally having the ability to rewrite your DNA and the messages that your genes are sending to the rest of your cell. These messages, in large part, play the determining role of you getting degenerative conditions and diseases or not. Now, over and over again, I keep hearing how we need to develop better drugs to treat the conditions that we're creating ourselves. So we need to make better drugs because we're not eating the foods that we should be eating. So rather than eating foods we should be eating, let's just develop better drugs to treat the condition I just got. Is that kind of backwards? So when I hear the advice, I need to increase my grains in my diet, I want you to consider what that grain, after it's broken down and digested, what is it broken down into? Well, it's broken down into glucose. That glucose raises your blood sugar, which then pumps insulin all around your body. Inflammation is the precursor to all chronic disease, including weight gain and Alzheimer's. A great report was published in the prestigious New England Journal of Medicine in September of 2013. And it took a group of people, 2,067 men and women, aged about 65 and older, and then watched these people over the next 6.5 years. Now, they're watching to see who got dementia and who did not, but they only measured one single measurement of these people that they were watching. And that single measurement was that decided whether they got dementia or not was their blood glucose levels, how much blood sugar they had. And what they found was with even blood sugar with a mild elevation of 150 compared to 110, right? What they found is, by the way, 110 is well below, or 115 is still below the levels of being diagnosed with diabetes. So if you go into your doctor and you're fasting and you have a blood sugar of 121, he'll say that you're diabetic. All right, you need to start going on medication. So they found that below that, if you go into and you're at 110 or 115, your doctor won't tell you you're diabetic. He might say you're getting close, you're pre-diabetic. But this study was looking at just at being at 115, your chances of getting dementia was 25% higher. If you bump it up, blood glucose to 140, which is not hard to do at all, less than a can of pop will do that. Now you just bumped up your risk of getting Alzheimer's another 20%. So you got to ask, is grain really worth it? Now, I'm not a total hater of gluten by any means. There are some strong arguments of how gluten is bad and how it's good for us. With what I've read, I sit kind of in the middle based on the data, with the idea that gluten can be a serious issue, but more of the issues come from gluten that we don't have the same bread today that we had hundreds of years ago. But the biggest problem with gluten is that our microbiome ability to digest this gluten has been compromised, and our body can end up seeing that gluten protein as a toxin because it doesn't have a strong enough digestive bacteria to break it down. So in the book, The Brain Grain from Dr. Perlmutter that I talked about in the beginning, points to gluten being bad for most people and not to eat it. But he recommends that because of an enzyme deficiency. People just don't have the digestive enzyme. It talks about how gluten leads to issues that cause inflammation and the pivotal role of inflammation in neurodegenerative conditions like Alzheimer's. Now remember, he's a brain doctor. right? That's where he has his experience from. So the book really went into great discussion about, or based on current peer-reviewed studies, science, of how elevated glucose, then by insulin, then by inflammation, all from these gluten products, which is breads, and how you're getting closer to the risk of Alzheimer's and dementia. And in the Brain Maker book, it comes all afterwards. And what it does, it extrapolates all of the data in the notion that your diet really does come down to your DNA. And it's just a new concept. We really haven't thought about how food has the ability to impact the messages that our DNA is transcribing when it's making new cells. It talks more about how blood sugar levels and the other related issues of DNA in the foods we eat on our blood sugar. So it also talked about this DNA expression on our microbiome, those bacteria that are living with us. Now, if you missed my program that I talk extensively about the microbiome, your microbiome is just basically a big old family of bacteria, lots of different strains, a lot of different cultures that are living on your skin and in your skin. And there's just all different types. We've identified about 3,500 bacteria on and in our body so far, but we only know about 800 to 1,000 of those, what they do. Well, we know the rest are there. And I'm not talking about pathogens. I'm not talking about the ones that kill us, that are bad for us. They're there for a purpose, right? So if you add them all up, your microbiome is 100 trillion organisms living on your body and in your body. Now that has a huge impact on us. So what you're eating is determining the factor of how your food is affecting the microbiome. Now, to put in perspective, your number of microbiome, kind of see them like a parasite. Okay, like you see in those shark movies where you see that little parasite fish that's swimming alongside or stuck to the fish. That's a parasite, and they actually benefit the mammal and help them clean these parasites off their skin. So these attachments to them are good. Well, there is more than 10 times more microbiome in our body than there are human cells. So one could actually argue and say it's not the microbiome, it's not these bacteria that's the parasite, it's us that's the parasite to these bacteria, because there's so many more of them than there are of us. It's kind of an interesting twist, but the idea is that together that makes up who we are. These bacteria are there to serve us. We want to make sure that we're getting the ones that we want to give our genes the expression that we want. Now, you don't have to take bacteria in a pill form. You can get it from eating foods that are fermented and rich in good bacteria, as well as foods that are rich in what's called a prebiotic. So you can get a prebiotic that is basically food for the bacteria. They need to feed on that, and it keeps them strong. A weak microbiome means that you have a weak supply of prebiotics. What's the main benefit of the paleo diet? It's really the introduction of prebiotic fiber to your microbiome. That's you probably haven't heard it explained that way, but that's essentially what it is. Is the benefit of the paleo diet is it's really great for feeding prebiotic food, giving food to your microbiome. Our forefathers were estimated to have consumed over 135 grams of prebiotic fiber a day, whereas the typical American today, we get about 5 grams. That's 25 times or 27 times less than what our ancestors got. So you need to have more prebiotic fibers than you're currently getting. That's one of the reasons why we will fortify our 0-calorie sweetener that we have with both pre and probiotics. We also put it in our shake that you hopefully are drinking every day to give your microbiome a good supply of food so that you're getting a good ample amount of that every single day. But even that, I got to admit, isn't enough. You could be helping it out by eating prebiotic foods like Mexican yams and Jerusalem artichokes, asparaguses, onions, leeks, garlic. These are some of my favorites, but they're great sources of this prebiotic. Another way I get all three of the bacteria and a prebiotic is through our homemade yogurt. You've heard me talk about that. So we make it at home simply because the store stuff is not very good. I've been looking at another book by Dr. Gary Taubes. He wrote a book that talked about why we get fat and what to do about it. It makes a really interesting statement in that book in that he says mild ketosis is probably the condition that humans have been in since we began walking this planet. Now, they come to this not by just an assumption. They've got the paleontologists have been able to go back and run DNA sequencing on our ancestors' remains, because as you probably have heard, that you can still pick up DNA from these their teeth and their bones and their skin and their hair, and from that they can derive what types of foods that they ate. Now, not only did our forefathers rarely had an occasion. They weren't farmers. That hasn't happened to just recently, the last 10,000 years. But they didn't farm crops. They just ate what they came across. The only time they came across a carbohydrate was when it was naturally growing during the season, and they happened to stumble across an apple, a crab apple tree, or maybe some berries. They most definitely didn't walk into an apple orchard and start pulling, oranges and plums and apples off the tree, because they just didn't exist. So basically, we've had very few carbohydrates in our ancestry, higher proteins, and certainly a much, much higher fat. Fat is a terrific fuel that you're trying to survive, because it gives 225% more calories for every gram in comparison to 1 gram of protein or a carbohydrate. That's why our ancestors loved it. So fat turns out to be a super fuel for the brain. Now, Dr. Mark Madsen, as an example, has done a lot of research in this area and has published them in the journals dealing with aging and the function of the brain, burning fat as a fuel instead of glucose. Now, when I say burning fat as a fuel, let's just be more accurate. I'm actually talking about ketones, because directly your brain can't burn fat as a fuel. It has to burn it as a ketone. But I'm taking a shortcut a little bit that just understand that when I say the brain's burning fat as a fuel, I'm talking about the ketones that after that fat's broken down. That's what you get. That's the fuel that the brain's using. So when the brain is burning ketones, it's far more efficient in its metabolism. He's shown that in his book, so as have other researchers. It creates less damaging free radicals, which we know have to be controlled, than sugars or carbohydrates do, which are rampant in free radicals. And it pulls out more energy per molecule. So when you reduce your carbohydrates, take into account that you're basically balancing out your FPC balance. This is a good thing. Your body starts to burn ketones for energy instead of glucose. And once you do that, some really incredible things start happening. You find that your energy actually improves. You're eating less carbohydrates, but you're getting more energy, and it lasts longer. You feel more alert. Your brain functions much better, and you probably the best benefit out of all of them is that your insulin levels are low, and that means that your inflammation is low. Now, a great way to kickstart your body into making ketones is when you've decided to cut your carb to say 5 or 10% of your total caloric intake. You could start doing some intermittent fasting. You've heard me talk about that. Missing a couple of meals won't kill you, I promise. By fasting, your glucose and insulin will drop down very fast within a day. And you're already starting to make ketones. Don't think that boosting your glucose and your insulin levels up and down all over the place like a roller coaster doesn't leave a black mark on your health record. It's actually, they've shown that it's leaving impressions on your gene sequencing. And we want to avoid that because that negative expression is not good. They've linked it right to these chronic distortions that we're getting. Now, I'm not saying that you can't enjoy some sweets or some grains. I just experienced a birthday myself. My wife made my favorite cake, which was excellent, by the way. It was all from scratch. Yeah, you pretty much have to make it from scratch. But she made German chocolate cake using our flour, using our sweetener, using our fat blocker. And I got to tell you, it's the best German chocolate cake I've had perhaps forever, but I haven't had one for so long that I'm just going to count it up as the best one I've ever had. So I enjoyed it, but what I did was I followed this regimen. So I'm not saying that you can't do it, or if you're going to go out and have a high carb meal, maybe in addition to some German chocolate cake, or let's just say you're going to have some spaghetti and some French bread. And of course, you got to have a cup of Italian spumoni ice cream, right? You could go back on your low carb diet and wait for your glucose, insulin levels to get rid of that glycogen weight. It'll take about 4 or 5 days. Or I could just hop on, do an intermittent fast right after the meal, skip a couple of meals, right? Hit the gym and work out while I'm fasting, and I'm back to normal. My blood glucose, my insulin levels are back to normal in 24 hours, 36 at the most. 90%, I was talking about microbiome a little bit. 90% of all the peer-reviewed literature published on your microbiome has only been published in the last 5 years. What does that tell you? That tells you that it's very fast emerging. We, because of some technology, we're understanding much more about what these bacteria are doing. So be prepared. You're going to hear a lot more about it in the future. But I was looking at this one study that only added 5 bacteria, just 5, to a subject that they were testing. Now remember, my homemade yogurt that I make at home, it has 53 strains of bacteria. So this study was only with 5. And the trial actually had some really profound effects on regulating the mood of these people just by adding five bacteria. And prebiotics to your gut has the power to change a person's mood. So, we talk about this gut-brain connection by the way of the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is just runs right from our tail right up to our brain stem. And that is the communication that they finally confirmed. The channel or the telephone wire, if you will, that the gut communicates to the brain. And it's not, as we once thought, it's just the brain sending out signals. It's actually the other way. A lot of data from your DNA, from the food you're eating, is being translated through its expression on your microbiome, your bacteria, and it travels up the vagus nerve to your brain. And it's telling your brain in terms of make more, make less inflammation, increase this, increase that. But it also, in this study, showed that it had a lot of mood regulation. So if you want to be in a better mood, then watch what you're eating. A popular term for the vagus nerve is the second brain. There's been some research that's suggesting that your gut really is your first brain and could be more important in how it controls the rest of your body and how healthy you'll be. That's still out on that. That's a pretty provocative statement that it's your first and more important brain, but it's interesting at the very least. So let me show you what I mean by that connection and how your gut affects your mood. Looking at major depressive disorders and the relationship to leaky gut. So we're only talking about depressive people that were depressed, major depression, and the relationship to a leaky gut. Now, when you have a leaky gut, you know that you've got some major problems with your microbiome. Your gut bacteria is not doing well. That's how you know you got leaky gut. Okay, so they took these people and they found on this chart here that a peer-reviewed study showing that higher levels of this LPS that dramatically increased the conditions of leaky gut and the person's mood. Now, LPS stands for liposaccharides. It's a compound in your body chemistry. It is an indication of leakiness in the wall that correlates to major depression. It also correlates to things like Lou Gehrig's disease and Alzheimer's, even autism. So you know, this gut-brain connectivity theory has really got some merit. It's really got some teeth to it. So you have to remember that your gut bacteria outnumber your cells, your human cells, by a factor of 10 to 1. What's also interesting is that 99% of your DNA in your body is also bacterial. So genetically, you are not just the 23 genes that you got from your mom and dad. You are also a child, so to speak, that comes from the bacteria that lives in you, and the foods that you're eating, feeding that gut bacteria, and what that food's messages is giving to your DNA when it remakes and replicates the cells in your body. Now, I want you to understand the power that you have in controlling what type of bacteria is in you. And that means that the expressions and influences they'll have on your DNA, that translates to your health, a direct correlation, or not even correlation, a causation, all by making the wrong food choices. You can mess things up by taking antibiotics, by drinking water that is chlorinated, by eating foods that are high in carbohydrates and sugar, by making the wrong food choices can threaten those gut bacteria and change a whole array of the diversity of bacteria living within you. And that is precisely how you change your health. Now, some of you may have heard you give a child an antibiotic, and in months, in the following years, they develop autism. And so there is an argument saying that certain types of antibiotics are linked to autism. Now, what they're finding as they delve into this more is it's really the impact of the antibiotic killing off certain bacteria that's in that child. And net result of that dead or absent bacteria in their microbiome is causing the symptoms of autism. And there has been some cases where they reintroduce those microbiome back into the child. They've done it by feeding them. They've done it by fecal transplant, where they actually take the poo from a healthy individual that has these healthy microbiome, transplant it into the child with autism, and in some cases, the autism symptoms are completely gone. In others, they're greatly reduced, or there's some improvement. So it's great research, but you can't ignore the fact that these bacteria and the DNA expression of these foods are having a tremendous impact on who we are, what we think, our mood. So it's a big deal. You got to watch what you're taking. All right. So you might be thinking this thought: did my gut get messed up when I started eating all the wrong foods, or was my gut bacteria messed up when I was born? And if it was when I was born, am I cooked, or can I fix it? Okay. So that's an excellent question. Thank you for asking. The question is, or the answer is, we all know that we don't eat all the same foods, right? And the fact is that we are not all born the same way either. Let me explain. About a third of American children go through a medical procedure where they're essentially born without a microbiome in their gut. As a baby in the womb, they don't need gut bacteria to digest their food. They are fed intravenously through the umbilical cord. They get the bacteria that the mother has. In a study from France, here posted in Nature, they found that a newborn baby had the same bacteria from the mother that was transferred through her blood and through the umbilical cord. Some different bacteria was transferred through the amniotic fluid. And again, different bacteria strains transferred when the baby passes through the vaginal canal. What was interesting is that they found unique bacteria in the baby's mouth that wasn't found in the mother, right? And that's from outside influences, like in the operating room, for example. And those bacteria were able to pass from the mouth to the baby's bloodstream and travel to the different parts of the body. Think about that for a second. I've just told you how vitally important gut bacteria is to our health at the point of birth. Can you imagine the uphill battle that an infant is facing when they're born without any bacteria? And the mother doesn't have, what about if the mother herself doesn't have healthy bacteria? She doesn't transfer good bacteria back to her child. So that's vitally important. When I said that 1/3 of children are going through a medical procedure where they're essentially born without a microbiome in their gut, you know what that's called? That procedure is called the cesarean section or the C-section. When a child is born by cesarean section, the newborn is deprived of that really important inoculation. Really, it's like the mother's way of giving antibiotics, healthy ones, to prepare that baby as a starter kit of the best scenario for health as it's introduced into this environment with all kinds of viruses and bad bacteria. Studies have found that babies born through the C-section have twofold, 200% increase of autism and a threefold, 300% increase of ADHD, a significant increase of type 1 diabetes, celiac disease, food allergies, and even becoming obese as an adult. That's a strong signal that the bacteria that the baby would normally get through the vaginal canal is there to protect the baby. Now, here's a picture. I found this fascinating. These are actual real pictures on an electron microscope of two different strains of bacteria on the skin of a baby's belly button when it was born, or just at the base of the umbilical cord. Now, I mentioned that the C-section babies, I guess the reason why I like this picture, going back to it, is look how the kind of birds of a feather flock together. How uniquely, obviously in this example, they're different colors, but they stay in their own group. They like to stay in their own culture. There's lots of different cultures it kind of see it like New York City, right? And have you noticed that when you go to a city and you have, Asian a population, you have German, you have African American, you have these different cultures in these large cities. They have a tendency to kind of clump together. They like to be amongst their own cultures. And apparently here in our microbiome, it's doing the same thing. You don't see any red ones over in the green or vice versa, but your gut needs diversity. We don't want all red. We don't want all green. We want varying different degrees. I told you that they found about 3,000 so far. Only about 1,000 of them do they know anything about what they do for us. But we want this culture. We want that diversity. So I talked about the C-section, babies having a 50% increase of becoming obese as an adult. Now, that's a huge increase. It's hard for me to imagine that 1/3 of all babies must be born by C-section as a medical necessity. So I did some research. Here's a graph of all the countries, and it shows their percentages of a C-section. So Turkey, clear on there on the left, they top out at 53% of all their babies are born C-section. Finland at the far right is the lowest at 15%. And look how C-sections are on the rise. So this chart, oh, by the way, we're at about 1/3 in the US. So this chart shows that it's the red line is representing the percentages of C-sections just in the last 10 years. It's a 50% increase in just the last 10 years. So let me ask you the same question that I asked. Do you believe that all of a sudden in the last 10 years that there's a medical necessity for C-section? It's increased that much. There's no other choice for the mother's health, for the baby's health. We have to have a C-section. Maybe not. So I did some more studies, and I found out that some women choose C-section as an element of control. Now, I'm not slamming women by any means, but this is what this study found. Some women choose C-section, unlike other countries where C-section can be a challenge, like in Turkey. Women in the U.S. can simply choose to have a C-section. It gives them a lot more control over childbirth rather than waiting to go into labor naturally. They may want to have the baby on a certain day or a certain birthday, or when they're off on vacation or when they're not at work, right? Or they may do it to avoid pain. Baby doctors in the U.S. are sued a lot. The reality is that we have more C-sections because doctors are using the C-section as a defense mechanism or defense medicine, giving doctors the most aggressive care possible to avoid a neglectful lawsuit or a negligence lawsuit, right? They don't want to be sued, so they just go and say, well, I didn't want to risk anything, and I just, boom, did a C-section, okay? If a baby is born via C-section, there's a bad outcome, the doctor can always say, everything was done as I was taught in school. We did, the hospital did everything they could to save the baby and the mother. But if it's born vaginally, then the court or the attorney can say, did you do everything you could? Why didn't you do a C-section and just avoid the whole matter? So legal gets into our help. Much of the evidence on defense medicine is anecdotal, but there are slightly higher C-section rates in states that have higher caps on malpractice settlements. I found that interesting. So where there's higher caps on malpractice, that's where they have higher rates of C-sections. Amazing. Okay. In a 2009 study, it's found that doctors aren't the ones at fault. There are financial incentives for hospitals to have higher C-sections because they can charge more to the mother and family. Is that a reason to have one? Technology is raising more alarms during labor. And that's another reason for C-section, meaning we've gotten better at detecting the baby and seeing what the baby's experiencing. We don't necessarily know what it means, but we see that the heart rate of the baby goes up, and that means that the baby's under more stress. And we then just trigger and say, well, that means we're going to do a C-section. We don't want the baby under stress. Well, is that such a good idea? It's okay. We've been birthing humans under stress for a long time. All of a sudden, we're just going to slice the belly open and avoid that healthy microbiome or those bacteria being transferred to the baby. So consider the baby being born through the birthing canal, kind of like the baby's first Christmas gift of good health. There are different bacteria that start at the beginning of the canal and the middle and the end of the canal. They're not all the same. That's why experts are recommending that if a C-section is absolutely necessary, that that they go through this procedure called a vaginal swab. Now, this technique is where they take a 4x4 medical sponge. It's placed in the birth canal prior to the C-section and before the mother goes into the operating room. And it gets this major blast of antibiotics. So they put it in before she gets on the antibiotics, right, which we all know kill bacteria. And then the sponge is removed before the antibiotics are given. And then it's put in this moist, warm environment to keep the bacteria alive. Then after the baby is born, they take the sponge out and smear it all over the baby's skin. They put it in the baby's mouth, its eyes, nose, all over. They're trying to mimic what happens if it was born vaginally. And this is the next best thing if a C-section is absolutely necessary. So something you want to pass on to any of your friends or family that are about to have a baby. So the message for today that I wanted to get to is what you eat affects your DNA. It affects your microbiome and your bacteria that you have, you can't avoid it, that's in and on your body. Food has data. Food has messages that's translated and given to your DNA. Don't mess it up. Give the right message. Have your DNA transcribe the right data that you want. You want to be healthy? Then eat the foods that have been found to make you healthy. You want to have a healthy life? Then give your body the right bacteria that you want. That baby should be exposed. Let the baby eat the dirt that's outside. That baby doesn't know what it's doing. It is an inherent reaction to have them put things in their mouth. Why? It's not only for sensory acuity, for them learning what it is. It's to get a wide and broad microbiome. One study showing that when that baby's first born, those first few years are critical to determining what kind of foods that baby will be tolerant of, allergic to later on. So experiencing you don't have to feed them yogurt or sauerkraut or peanut butter, but just a little swab on your finger and just place it on their tongue or on the inside of their cheek and let that get into the body. Again, don't feed them a sandwich. They're not ready to be on solid food yet, but you're exposing them to little bits of these varying foods of dairy and gluten and peanut butter so that they are tolerant of it. Their body understands what it is so that they don't have these allergic reactions. So thank you for your time. Any of your family members want a better chance, a better head start on their health, then have them stop by. Send them the recorded message. Have them go to 3 Beliefs. See what science has to offer and what we do know about how to overcome our chronic issues, things like weight and type 2 diabetes and Alzheimer's and cognitive ability, those kind of things. Have them call. Just make sure that you give them your phone number or have them go to your webpage that's tailored just for you. And that way you know that you get all the credit and the information that you're due. So I love you. I appreciate your time. Thank you for staying online. And for heaven's sakes, take care of your DNA. We'll see you next week. Oh, you know what? Let me check real quick. I've been trying to check my messages. Microbiome. One question, how do I know what bacteria I need? Well, we're not quite there yet. We don't know. So getting a variety, getting lots of different types of fermented foods. I choose mine by making my homemade yogurt. I can control the fat, I can control the sugars and the artificial flavors in it. And then I add to it 53 strains of bacteria. So I'm getting a wide, broad variety. And I don't eat it as much as I just put it in my mouth. I'll take a tablespoon, put it in my mouth in the morning, one at night before I go to bed. I will eat it sometimes like I would a bowl of ice cream because I just want some taste, but I just introduce it into my gut every day just so that it's there, just so it's populating, just so it's influencing the rest of my biome. So you could do the same thing, but you can do it with more diverse foods if you don't want to use the 53 strains. So great question. Take care. We'll see you next week.